Welcome back. Session 2 will be discussing issues in US-China-Japan dynamics. The chairperson is Mr. Daljit Singh, ISIS Senior Research Fellow and Coordinator of the Institute's Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program. He is joined by speakers Major General Su Chenghu and Professor Tomohito Shinoda and Ms. Bonnie Glaser. So soon on the screens we'll be showing some details in session 2. Over to Mr. Daljit Singh.
Good morning. We can start the second session now. I will not introduce the speakers because you already have the CVs. In this way we can save time. So I'll ask Major General Zhu to first give his presentation for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've been tasked to talk on both Sino-Japanese and Sino-US relations. It's really an arduous task for me to touch upon such two very, very complex bilateral relations. First of all, a few words about Sino-US relations. I think since the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, the relations have been constructive, even though there are ups and downs, twists and turns. But both sides are working to the direction of constructive relationship between the two sides. Nowadays, I think this relationship is very, very important, not only for these two countries, but also for the region and the world at large. Therefore, a Chinese new leader has put forward the idea of establishing a new type of major power relationship, which, of course, include the Sino-US relations. Why China advocates the new type of relationship between China and the United States? Because of the following reasons. Number one is the changing world, because we are facing new situations. Secondly, I think we have some problems that the world is facing. Some of the problems need to be addressed by China and the United States in collaboration. And thirdly, the relations between the two countries are not equal enough. For example, China's establishment of ADIZ, which was very strongly criticized by the United States and Japan. But there is the problem, why cannot China establish such a zone? Because the United States established in early 50s. Therefore, no international law forbids China to establish such a zone. And furthermore, China is not the first country to establish such a zone in the world. And China is not the first country to establish such a zone in East China Sea. Some countries have extended their zone to the coast area of China. Why cannot Chinese establish it? So China's establishment of the zone was seriously criticized. So this shows that the relationship between China and the United States are not equal. So this is one thing. Of course, there are some problems. The fourth one is that there are problems in bilateral relations between China and the United States. I believe that the frictions between the two major economic entities are quite normal, because we witnessed a lot of frictions between China and Japan in 1970s, 1980s, and even 1990s, even now. So it's quite normal because there are competition in the economic sense between the two sides. But the real problems between China and the United States lie in security and the military sector. There are mainly three major problems. One is distrust. As you know, Chinese will never convince the Americans that China will develop in a peaceful way, no matter how Chinese explain themselves to the American friends. Of course, it is very difficult for the Americans to make the Chinese believe that their actions, like arms sale to Taiwan, close-range reconnaissances against China, large-scale exercises against China, and defense technologies embargo and arms embargo to China are for the interest of China. So under such a situation, it is very, very difficult for Chinese and the Americans to establish strategic trust. Because of the shot of trust, therefore they've got a lot of miscalculations. Whatever the Americans do in East Asia are believed by the Chinese. These actions are intended against China. While whatever the Chinese do in East Asia, especially in the military sector, the military development, the development of Chinese PLA Navy, are intended against the United States. And this is intended to drive the Americans out of Western Pacific, not to mention out of Japan and ROK. Actually, that's the business between the United States and Japan and ROK. That's not the business of China. So it is very difficult. We have a lot of miscalculations. Because of the first and the second problems, we have got third one, that is action and reaction. Even though Chinese do not believe that there are arms races between China and the United States, actually, there are all-round races between China and the United States. Of course, I have to admit that the races between China and the United States are totally different from that between the United States and the former Soviet Union, which intended by both sides to seek absolute superiority. But China will never seek any superiority over the United States, but just seek adequate but credible deterrence. That's enough for China. So we have races from outer space to cyberspace. We have races from the nuclear area to conventional area. We have races from the traditional security area and the non-traditional security area. These are the problems. Therefore, I believe to maintain the constructiveness of the relationship between China and the United States, both sides should restrain themselves from their behavior. And both sides should try to find new areas of cooperation. Otherwise, the relationship between China and the United States might be very, very, very destructive instead of constructive in East Asia. Of course, here, besides the three problems, I think there are some new problems. One is China's development. On China's development, I believe it all depends on the outsiders, how the outsiders evaluate China's development. Because if you believe that China's development is a positive factor, and it will be a positive factor. If you believe China is a friend, China will be a very loyal friend. If you believe China is a partner, and China will be a very, very constructive partner. Of course, if you believe that China is an enemy, Chinese will have to be prepared to be a qualified enemy. I find that in some of the government agencies of the United States may modify their evaluation of China's development a little bit. In the first 30 years, they believed China's development is positive. But nowadays, some people in Washington may believe that China's development may challenge the leadership of the United States in the future. So this is the challenge for Sino-US relations. Another factor is modification of US policy, such as towards Asia, such as rebalance back to Asia or pivot to Asia, etc. These have actually produced a tremendous impact on regional security situation and on Sino-US relations. I think this is pretty much concerned with every country in this region. I don't think I have time to detail it. So if you have any question on that, I will be more than glad to answer them. Now let me turn to Sino-Japanese relationship. I think Sino-Japanese relations are really problematic in the recent 2 years. And I don't think this sort of situation is something that both Chinese and Japanese are willing to see, but it is there. I think there are a lot of problems. Some of the problems are very, very serious. If they are not very well managed, I think it may produce even worse impact on not only Sino-Japanese relations in the future, but also in the peace and stability in East Asia. Of course, the problems arising between China and the United States mainly result from the following factor. Number one is that the post-Second World War order was not implemented. This is mainly manifested in 4 areas. Number one, as the victorious country of China did not send its troops to Japan together with the United States. Secondly, territorial disputes was not addressed. Thirdly, some of the war criminals were not punished, and this has laid seeds for the rising of right-wing, I don't want to use the word militarists or militarization. And lastly, United States and Japan signed the peace agreement in San Francisco, and also the reversion agreement of Ryukyu Islands. So these are the 4 problems that are existing that reflects the unimplementation of the Second World Order. This is second one is the history issue, because Japanese Liberal Democratic Party has always rejected, denied the history of aggression, denied the guilty of that war they committed against those countries in East Asia. And third is the territorial disputes as resulted from the unimplementation of the post-World War order. Another one is the right turn of Japanese politics. I don't want to criticize Mr. Abe, but Mr. Abe really is not very responsible for Sino-Japanese relations, because he has voiced on so many occasions on China threat or encircling containing China, etc. If you look at China's leadership, like Mr. Deng Xiaoping or Mr. Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang, I don't think they have voiced a single word that hurt sentiments of the Chinese people. So all these sort of things like ADIA, so he said that China must withdraw this sort of establishment. Is it possible? As a politician, you say such kind of words. It's impossible to be materialized. Why do you say that? It's not a real politician, a statesman. So I hope that Mr. Abe will be responsible enough and return to the right track. Otherwise, the relationship between China and Japan will be very, very dangerous. And of course, in the past, the economic ties have been already affected. As you know, 10 years ago, the trade volume between China and Japan ranked first in China's foreign trade. But nowadays, the trade volume between China and Japan has dropped to 5th in China's foreign trade. So this is a very, very specific manifestation of the worsening of the relationship between these 2 countries. Therefore, I hope that Japan will have to find the steps to step down. So on the Diaoyu Island, actually, I hope the audience present here will take into consideration of the following issue. Number one, China did not advocate to purchase the island. Second, China did not advocate nationalization of the island. Third, China did not send its military aircraft to the air of Diaoyu Island first. Number 4, China did not send its warships first to the water in the vicinity of the island. Therefore, which side broke the status quo? I hope all of us will take into consideration all these issues. Thank you very much.
Professor Tomohito Shinoda will now give the Japanese perspective on Sino-American-Japanese relations.
Thank you very much. I am very honored to be here, and in my presentation I'll be responding to some of the points raised by General Chu. This session would have been more interesting if I were a nationalist scholar who defended Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni. However, I'm not. I'd like to just explain what the Yasukuni Shrine is about. It's a problem because in 1978, 14 war criminals, which was national leader during that war period, were enshrined. Before then, it was not a problem. And it enshrines 2.5 million war deaths. So it's not only about those national leaders. So it's pure, I think it's pure feeding for Prime Minister Abe to want to visit there to pray for all those more than 2 million people who died for the government since 1870s. But it became only an issue. It became an issue only after 1985, Prime Minister Nakasone visited. And before that, it was not a political problem between, even no Koreans, no Chinese complained about the official visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. And I like to analyze, although I do not defend, but I like to analyze why Mr. Abe visited. And he has a strong belief. He explained his belief that he regretted that during his first term as a prime minister he didn't visit. But I did not think he was going to visit, because by not visiting he can use Yasukuni as a political card vis-a-vis Korea or China. And he didn't visit it for 1 year. And he was so disappointed that his refraining to visit the Yasukuni Shrine was not appreciated by either South Korea and China. And that he has been asking to have that summit meeting between top leaders, Japan and South Korea and China. It was not granted. So he was disappointed. And also former Prime Minister Koizumi, who is supposed to be the political mentor of the Prime Minister Abe, challenged him. Well, that the Japan-China relations would not go worse than currently it is. So that's another. And I've heard from a credible government source that the South Korean government has been asking as a condition to set up a summit meeting that the Prime Minister Abe to declare he would not visit. And he did not want to bend on this demand. And is Prime Minister Abe hawkish? And all the English newspaper says Japan's hawkish Prime Minister Abe. Yeah, he may be, but his policies are not hawkish. Not as described by the General Chu, that it's not Japan's step toward remilitarization. It's more like setting up National Security Council or having a secrecy law, collective self-defense right, which many other countries have. And constitution, I think there's a strong misunderstanding about the constitutional revision. Japan is not changing the constitution on Article 9, Paragraph 1, which describes renounce war. But just the Paragraph 2, which says no land, sea, and air forces. We have a self-defense force, which is very, very strong and probably ranked in 3 to number 5, depending on how you calculate. But so recognizing self-defense force in the Constitution is one of the main goals that Prime Minister Abe wants to do. And I'd like to talk about Abe's agenda to rewrite history. Probably he may be interested, but in the future, not now, because he has to deal with all those national security issues. He has established National Security Council, secrecy law enacted, and national security strategy defense outlines are out now. But still, there are many issues in the agenda to come. Relocation of the Futenma Air Base of the American Marines in Okinawa, or revision of U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, and allowing Japan to exercise collective self-defense, and constitutional revisions are the issues which would take another 2 or 3 years at least. So he will be busy, and I do not think he would even think about the rewriting of history before completing all those issues. Then I'd like to talk about the ADIZ, that the recent, and to respond to General Chu's. Yes, he's correct that China is entitled to establish its own ADIZ. However, it needs to follow international norm. Well, the problem is ADIZ is designed to set the zone so that it will give the time for the country to react the airplanes coming toward its territorial airspace. But so to this direction. However, China is demanding, even if airplanes flying in parallel to its coastline, and this is against international norm, and it's against the freedom of movement. And another problem of setting the ADIZ was that Chinese has demands. The first, they are asking notify to the Chinese Foreign Ministry and follow orders of the Defense Ministry. Otherwise, China would exercise emergency defensive measures. This is not what the ADIZ is about. Last Christmas, I know that some friends of mine told their sons, because they forgot to give them Christmas presents, Santa Claus did not come to Japan because of the Chinese ADIZ. Anyway, China thinks ADIZ is not the territorial airspace. China has a history of treating EEZ, exclusive economic zone, as a territorial water, and they might do the same thing to ADIZ. And that's one of the big problems we are facing. And there's a risk of accident. Between Japan and South Korea, there's some agreement set since 1995. We agreed to avoid accident by noticing 30 minutes prior to ADIZ approach. And there's no scramble should be operated over Takeshima Island. And so recently South Korea expanded its ADIZ, but it's not a problem to Japan. And we have a similar agreement with Taiwan, and we have 44 years of experience of scramble, and there's no accident. So that's one concern. China has no scramble experience, and we don't know what's going to happen. And well, this just shows the statistics. Japan scrambles with Chinese airplanes increasing rapidly in these years. It used to be that Soviet Union or Russia was the leading countries, but now China overpassed. And another issue is, can China cover ADIZ? And my answer is no. The new ADIZ is too vast. Their radar system cannot cover entire zones. Yeah, I think many of you know that the American military sent the B-52 to the Chinese ADIZ to see that the B-52 is bomber, much slower than the fighter planes. And it's bigger, and it has a sensor. if the radar detects it's a plane, they can sense it. But they detected that all the pilots on the airplane did not detect any radar from Chinese side. So Chinese side did not know what kind of plane went into its ADIZ. And so although Chinese claim that they did some scrambles, but there's no record of scrambles identified by either Japanese or American side. And another point I want to respond to General Chu's point, who rocked the boat first? General Chu said that Japan did, but I do not think so, because 1992, China announced the law of territorial sea, unilaterally claiming Senkaku as a territory. So it's not Japan did first in 2012. And also 2008, two investigation vessels explored extensively around the Senkaku Islands for 9.5 hours. That caused a big problem to Japan. And I like to skip the details to explain what the Japan's policy directions is. I think this is very interesting. I have a stronger China on the left side on the horizontal axis, and a stronger US on the right side, and stronger Japan on the top, and weaker Japan on the bottom. If we have strong China, weak Japan, that the East Asia would have a Sino-centric region with hegemony by China and less American involvement, and there's an empty US-Japan alliance. And most nations in Asia would be close to China. If we have a combination of strong Japan and strong China, which is upper left side, US-Japan alliance versus China, confrontation would arise. And there will be very influential China and weaker US presence. And so there will be a new kind of Cold War framework. And some nations close to China, some nations close to the US-Japan alliance. And on the bottom right hand, we have a weak Japan and strong US. And what happened? There will be instability and frictions. There will be a US-centered East Asia, and US try to seek stability with China because Japan is not dependable. And we will have a US-Japan alliance very weak. And there will be frictions between China and other countries. So Japan is aiming towards up and right-hand corner, where we expect that the strong Japan and the strong United States will be established in the future. Where if we do that, we're going to have an East Asian community, and there will be multilateral international system with US-Japan leadership. And there will be a cooperation framework on politics, economics, military. And Japan would be playing an important role in establishing a regime. And that the Chinese would have to reluctantly accept this situation. And I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, Bonnie Glaser to provide the US perspective.
Thank you, Chair. I have been asked to focus on the US-China relationship. If somebody would like to discuss the US role in this East China Sea or broader Sino-Japanese relationship, we can certainly do that in the Q&A. But there is much to say about the US-China relationship. It is, of course, very complex. There are many positive and negative trends. There is cooperation intermingled with competition. And I agree with many of the things that Major General Ju Chung-Hu has said earlier. In the area of positive and cooperative developments, I too would emphasize the importance of US-Chinese presidents understanding, agreement to try and work towards building a new type of major power relationship. I would emphasize that this is a work in progress. I think that there is agreement on the negative definition of what this relationship is or what they should avoid. That is, the historical pattern of a rising power confronting an existing power, ending up in a major war. Neither the United States nor China would benefit from such an outcome. So there is an understanding to try to expand cooperation and, importantly, to control and manage differences. I think the two countries are still working on what a positive definition of this new model of major power relations would look like, and there is still substantial disagreement. Another area that I would point to that is a positive development is in the US-China military relationship, where we have seen deeper dialogue, we've seen expanded military exercises in the past year. The topics being discussed have also expanded. We're talking about cybersecurity, space, even nuclear weapons. Many of these issues were really considered somewhat taboo in the past because there was Chinese reluctance to engage in them. And there has also, of course, been positive cooperation on regional issues and in multilateral settings, such as on Iran and to some extent on North Korea. I don't want to dwell or spend the entire 15 minutes on the positive issues because I think it's important to really understand the challenges that both of our countries face. And here again, I probably will repeat a few of the things that General Zhu talked about. But I'd like to divide the issues that I'm going to talk about really into several categories. One is those issues that could just trigger increased tensions, political tensions, and then those issues that could potentially cause military conflict, because I think it's important to understand those in the distinction between them. So in the first category of those issues that could cause increased political tensions, I would start by mentioning North Korea. I think that, again, although there has been some limited cooperation between the US and China and North Korea, we did see a divergence when North Korea sunk the Chonan, for example, in 2010, and they shelled Yeongbyo-do Island. This was obviously a very different response between the US, South Korea, Japan, many other countries on the one hand, and China on the other. We certainly could see some provocations by North Korea. We might see some more nuclear tests, missile firings. It remains to be seen how China would react. We could even see a military attack or of some kind on South Korea once again. But the broader point I'd like to make here is that the United States is seeking to force North Korea to choose between economic development and having a nuclear weapons program. This is a very difficult strategy to achieve success when China is in fact very supportive of promoting a better North Korean economy. This is not a strategy that China is on board with. And so I think that there could easily be renewed tensions over North Korea. The second area is cyber issues, and particularly the issue of the use of cyber to essentially steal economic proprietary information, intellectual property. This is an issue that was quite prominent earlier this year. It was really front and center when President Obama met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. It is to some extent receded in the background, perhaps because the United States has lost the moral high ground due to Edward Snowden. But in my own view, there is a distinction that needs to be made between the use of cyber for intelligence, for surveillance, though I wouldn't completely defend all of what that is associated with, but to distinguish between that and the use of cyber for economic espionage and economic advantage. And so this is something that I think could lead to tensions going forward, particularly if the United States were to impose sanctions on China for its use of cyber to gain economic advantage. And there have been some very prominent individuals in the United States, as well as in Congress, that have advocated targeted sanctions. The third area that could cause tensions between the US and China is arms sales to Taiwan. And indeed, I would posit that it is unlikely to have the entire second Obama term go without another US arms sale to Taiwan. So the question really is what the United States will sell and when. I think that it's uncertain how China will or would respond. It will in part depend on how the United States handles it, what type of weapons platform is sold. But I would not rule out that China would respond in a tough manner, perhaps even following through and placing on sanctions on American companies, as was discussed in the past when the U.S. has sold arms to Taiwan. So we could see suspension of some, if not all, military exchanges and other actions. I personally think China's reaction could potentially be quite tough if the weapon system were very advanced. And then the last issue that I would point to is the potential for another incident in China's exclusive economic zone. Certainly, this, in my view, is not likely to escalate to war. We have seen an incident in 2001, 2009 with the impeccable, and just on December 5th, the recent Cowpens incident when it was shadowing China's aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, that was conducting sea trials. So I think that it would if such an incident were to occur, that it would likely be controlled and diffused, but I do think it potentially could lead to a political crisis, and we did see this in 2001. There's also, of course, the issue of our different interpretations of UNCLOS, and that indeed also causes political tensions. So now I'm going to turn to issues that could trigger US-China military conflict. And the first is, of course, the issue that we have heard both our Japanese and Chinese presenters talk about, and that is a Sino-Japanese contingency in the East China Sea. And I think it's widely believed, certainly in China and in the United States, and many people, I think, have this fear in Japan as well, that there could actually be the outbreak of some kind of conflict. It could be a miscalculation, it might be an accident, but escalation may not be able to be controlled. If this were to involve islands under Japan's administrative control, if Japan were to request assistance from the United States, clearly the Obama administration and before it the George W. Bush administration made it quite clear that these islands are covered under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. I think that, of course, this is scenario dependent. But it is quite likely the United States would come to the aid of its ally. This is one of the reasons why the U.S. has made this so clear to China, to try to discourage any potential miscalculation. The second issue that, of course, the U.S. and China could go to war over is Taiwan. Taiwan is always the most dangerous, but probably today the least likely source of a conflict between the U.S. and China. But I don't think that it could be ruled out. We certainly will see new elections in Taiwan in 2016. I don't think that the election of a DPP president in Taiwan would necessarily lead to a war, nor even a political crisis. But it is possible to imagine a situation in which China is less patient with a DPP president, even one that is not necessarily pursuing very provocative pro-independence policies. After all, the China today, or even then of 2016, is not the same as the China in 2000 when Chen Shui-bian came to power. And then the last issue that I would highlight that could result in a military conflict is the potential for severe instability in North Korea. This is something that I've done quite a bit of work on, not the issue of instability, but the potential and need for U.S.-China coordination to respond to the potential of instability in North Korea. If there were a conflict that were to spill over the borders, or instability to spill over the borders, I think that there would be immediate concern in the United States about the potential for weapons of mass destruction facilities that might be unsecure, that there would be a need to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea, and there is quite a possibility that both U.S. and ROK forces could move north. Under certain circumstances, one could imagine China entering that war. And it's unlikely to be on the side of the U.S. and ROK, even though I think that China would not necessarily want to side with North Korea. But we could end up, all three countries, having boots on the ground in North Korea in ways that could be very, very dangerous. So I've been quite a strong advocate of preparations for instability between Washington and Beijing, and not much has happened in that regard. And the final thing that I'd like to talk about is the long-term issues that we really have to worry about between the U.S. and China. And Ju Chung-Hu talked about the absence of mutual trust, and I think that this is certainly important. From the U.S. point of view, and I think other countries have this concern, one of the really big concerns that we have about China is the ways in which China seeks to revise international laws, norms, and practices. It would be helpful if China were more transparent about its ambitions in this regard. And I don't want to suggest that the United States or other countries should stubbornly prevent any revision, modification of prevailing international laws or norms and practices. There are many improvements that could be made, I'm sure. But I would cite as an example the cyber area, where we don't have any rules, no laws, and actually Washington has very much encouraged China to sit down with other countries and write some rules of the road. We're trying to do this in terms of cooperation with China at sea, although there are many rules and practices and law that are already in existence. We shouldn't make an exceptional set of laws for China. But this is an area where I think potentially, if China presses for revisions of laws and norms in ways that benefit China at the expense of the US and the West and other countries, I think this could really produce intensive US-China strategic competition. And then finally, just to add one more set of concerns that I think the United States has, is really the strategic competition in the military realm. This gets a lot of attention in the United States and the Pentagon. I don't know how much attention it gets out here in Southeast Asia. But we see that China is developing a set of capabilities. We in the United States refer to this as anti-access area denial capabilities. This is China's efforts to prevent the United States from intervening in what it calls its near seas, the Yellow Sea, South China Sea, East China Sea, within the first island chain, in a crisis, whether it would be to defend Japan or Taiwan or various other scenarios. And China, of course, calls this counter-intervention capabilities. They have their own terminology. But this is a competition that is very, very worrisome, because this really gets at very core, if you will, interests or vital interests of the United States in maintaining freedom of access and freedom to maneuver within the Western Pacific. So this really goes to the heart of U.S. interests in the region. And so I think this is a source of great concern going forward, one that is not really being discussed between the U.S. and China. So I'll stop there and welcome your questions.
Thank you for all the speakers that kept to the time. Now we have 10 to 15 minutes time for interaction between the speakers, which I'll prompt. Before we ask questions from the floor. Perhaps I can start off by taking up Bonnie Glaser's concluding remarks in the paper, short paper she distributed, where she says in the longer term, the US and China have to make adjustments to accommodate each other's bottom line interests. Now, what are these bottom line interests which they cannot compromise on? So may I ask in turn first, General Zhu, what are China's bottom line interests in Southeast Asia, including South China Sea?
Okay. I believe that in Southeast Asia, China encourages the United States to have all round of links and engagement or involvement. Chinese does not introduce any policy which is exclusive. Actually, China has no capability to exclude the United States in the business of Southeast Asia and including South China Sea. Actually, but China is pretty much concerned if the rebalance of the US strategy in Asia continue to be like the policy that the United States is pursuing as such at present. The Southeast Asian nations might be forced to take a side between China and the United States. Of course, the United States say Chinese are practicing the strategy of anti-access and area denial. I don't know what it is. So they are talking about the freedom of navigation. Actually, US Navy warships or the vessels, civilian vessels, have never been jeopardized in its freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Not to mention by the state actors, but seldom affected by the those sort of non-governmental forces in South China Sea. So the freedom of action or freedom of navigation in South China Sea is actually not a it's not a problem. So the bottom line interest, I think, of China with Southeast Asia is the constructive and the mutual benefit relationship between China and those countries in Southeast Asia. So the China's policy towards South China Sea is to maintain the status quo. No party should try to break the status quo.
Okay, I think we have to conclude.
Thank you.
Yes, but in terms of the basic China's policy goals long term, China seems to see Southeast Asia, at least the mainland part of it, as part of its traditional sphere of influence. So is it negotiable over the long term?
I don't think Chinese take Southeast Asia as the sphere of influence. I think this is a little bit sense of Cold War mentality, because Southeast Asia is impossible to be exclusive from other countries, especially the United States and Japan. So we don't believe that Southeast Asia will be the sphere of influence of China. It's impossible. China has neither intention, no capability to include Southeast Asia into the sphere of China's influence.
Okay. Question for Bonnie Glaser. What about US basic interests which are non-negotiable or cannot be compromised in the Western Pacific and East Asia? I guess it would be Japan, Korea, and freedom of navigation. What do you say?
Well, that's a softball question. I think Secretary Clinton, when she attended, of course, the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in July of 2010 in Hanoi very clearly articulated U.S. interests. They are certainly preservation of freedom of navigation, peaceful resolution of disputes through dialogue, as I said earlier, respect for international laws and norms, and the ability, I think, to defend our allies. So you mentioned Japan and South Korea. Not being denied that ability is certainly a vital U.S. interest. I just want to comment very briefly on General Zhu's claim that China is not seeking in any way to block freedom of navigation. The dispute that the United States and China have over the interpretation of what activities can take place in a country's 200 nautical mile EEZ is an issue of freedom of navigation. And this covers over 1/3 of the world's ocean surface if China's interpretation were to be adopted by other countries. We now have seen that China is operating occasionally in some of U.S. EEZs around Guam and Hawaii, for example. This has presented some hope in the United States that as China's Navy evolves, as its capabilities improve, and as it operates further from its shores, that maybe China will in fact see that it's in its interest to adopt the interpretation that we have of military activities that can be conducted in a country's EEZ. But so far we have not seen that. But to date, I would say that is the most important distinction or difference that the US and China have over freedom of navigation. There are some other examples, as we saw with the Cowpens incident on December 5th. Japan was also observing an exercise which China said that was illegal, but according to international practice, I would say was not. So there are differences in our interpretation.
Okay, but you haven't mentioned Southeast Asia. I mean, Southeast Asia is not as important to U.S. basic fundamental interests as Japan and South Korea and freedom of passage. Where does Southeast Asia fit in? So long as you can pass through freely, over the longer term, Southeast Asia will rank less than Japan and Korea in terms of importance to the US, right?
I would disagree with that contention to some extent. I think the most striking element that is new about the U.S. rebalance to Asia, because let's remember so much of it is continuity with prior U.S. policy, but the newest part is truly the emphasis on Southeast Asia. And so I think that for the United States, ensuring that China does not dictate the outcome of disputes in this region has become vital to American interests.
Okay, Professor Shinoda, what are Japan's critical interests in East Asia? Very briefly.
East Asia?
Yeah, from Japan towards the Indian Ocean.
Well, freedom navigation is very important because we are the country which really depend on the trade. And so in order to secure freedom, I think Japan needs the cooperation from the Southeast Asian countries as well.
Yeah, okay. Brief.
I think China and the United States have got different understanding of the freedom of navigation. Of course, we Chinese would emphasize the harmless passage, because that is very important. Those sort of the warships waging into the formation of Chinese warships, we don't think that's the harmless passage, or the close-range reconnaissances against China. I don't think that we Chinese do not believe that is the a matter of freedom of passage, but it's really in the interest of the United States, but it's not in the interest of China. So we have different understanding and we have different interpretation of what is freedom of passage and what is harmless passage in East China Sea or South China Sea.
Okay. next point, this was discussed briefly over dinner last night. I thought it would be good to bring it up here. This address to General Zhu. Which would be less unpalatable or unpleasant to China? Number one, a Japan that is rearming with its alliance with the US becoming weaker, and possibly a Japan which acquires nuclear weapons, or B, a Japan that solidly sticks to the alliance with the US, and if it rearms, it will be only modestly in relation to building the total US-Japan capability, but Japan does not go out on its own. Between the two,
I think that's mainly the business of Japan, or the business between Japan and the United States. We Chinese have no or any say on that issue. But I think either of them has positive factors and negative factors. I believe that without the military alliance between Japan and the United States, I am afraid that Japan will rearm itself. And if you look at the rising nationalism at home in Japan, it will be a very, very terrible thing. I'm afraid that it may lose control from outsiders. And in that case, it may go further right. And it's very, very difficult for us to predict whether Japan will not go militarization in the future, because history is a very, very good lesson. Of course, as far as the military alliance between United States and Japan concerned, we are very strongly against that United States and Japan use this again to interfere into the internal affairs of China. This is my understanding. Thank you.
Okay. Finally, final question to Professor Shinoda.
Yeah.
There seems to be an increased divergence of interest between US and Japan over China. I mean, in fact, Japan is now in a hurry to become a normal country with a much stronger military capability. I mean, this is one sign of it, I think. So my question is, does Japan have full confidence in the US pivot and its commitment to safeguard US security?
The short answer is yes. I don't see that any divergence between the US and Japan, although there's some disagreement over the issues like Yasukuni. However, that the US and Japan hold a strong alliance to secure the regional peace. And again, that there's no remilitarization of Japan. We have been committing to peace last 68 years. And the basic attitude is not changed at all. And as the Prime Minister Abe said one thing clearly, and it is true, that Japan is not tend to go to war. Instead, Japan tried to avoid war to secure the stability in the region.
Okay. Well, now questions on the floor. Some questions have been sent to me, so maybe I'll take one or two of these before I...
Yeah, that's the...
push that up, yeah. Oh, is China going to declare an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea?
No.
No?
Not this year.
Okay.
Not this year.
Why no? Because the situation here is different from East China Sea. China declares it for the purpose of avoiding the conflict between China and Japan, avoid accidental incidents between China and Japan and between China and the United States. And furthermore, China intends to trigger a negotiation on the establishment of Code of Conduct in the area, in this region, between China on the one hand, and Japan and the United States on the other.
I seem to there's many questions here, which one or two which I wanted to ask. Well, one which I remember is there was a question on which said that Chinese scholars and officials have been talking about a new regional security architecture, which is more inclusive. In other words, China seems to be not entirely happy with the ASEAN-centered regional security architecture. So I think the question was, if it's not inclusive, if the ASEAN-based structure is not inclusive, what other countries should be included? Or what does China have in mind?
Actually, I believe that in this region we are not short of any architecture, especially the economic and the security architecture, but none of them is very, very effective. And Chinese, I don't think we have got any new idea about new architecture which will be exclusive. So China has been supporting the efforts of ASEAN in ARF, and also supporting the efforts of ASEAN as one entity in promoting peace and stability in this region. China also supports very, very strongly the leadership in regional securities dialogues, consultations, or seminars, and even in promoting the regional cooperations between the countries concerned. I don't think Chinese want to establish any architecture which will be led by China. We have neither capability nor intention. Thank you.
I have a question directed at Bonnie Glaser. Maybe you have already answered it in the presentation, but anyway, I'll say it because quite a number of people asked this. China's attempts to steal the commercial secrets of US corporations pale in comparison to US vast and intrusive surveillance of foreign countries. So why is the US making such a fuss over this issue? I mean, quite a number of people.
Again, I'm not going to defend US surveillance activities, although I would certainly argue that as a citizen of the United States, I don't want to see another terrorist attack on my country. And I am willing personally to give up a degree of personal freedom in order to ensure the security of my country. There is a debate. People will certainly think differently about that particular issue. But as a democratic society, I think that that's something that the United States is working on in various ways, including through the Congressional Commission that recently made some recommendations. But the point that I made, I think, still stands, and that is President Obama has called for an even playing field with China. The United States welcomes China's rise economically. There is no doubt about this. The United States was a very strong advocate of China joining the World Trade Organization. And you may have heard our National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, in her recent speech, making quite clear that we would welcome China joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership eventually if it qualified. So there is no question of the United States trying to prevent China's rise, contain it, or keep it down. But every country should have the ability to compete fairly. Certainly companies should have the ability to compete fairly. This is not just an issue of American companies. I travel all over the world. I talk to many representatives of companies in Europe, in Australia, and I'm sure there are many in this region as well, who have suffered from cyber attacks. And I'm not claiming that China hasn't suffered from cyber attacks, because of course China is a victim as well. But there is a relationship And you can see that this has been documented in many ways between Chinese companies that work for the Chinese government or the Chinese military and have stolen some information for economic advantage. So I think I personally hope that the Chinese dream is realized, as Xi Jinping has set out. This is China's national objective to achieve its rejuvenation, but it has to be done in a way that is fair. There can be no unfair advantage that is taken through the use of cyber. So I think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Okay. Okay, we can now have questions from the floor. Please use the microphone and identify yourself. Thank you. No questions? Tommy, you have got a question.
I had no question until you called on me. But I want, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, to make a sincere exhortation. Can you hear me? I want to make a sincere exhortation
yes, sure.
to Major General Zhu and to Professor Shinoda.
Okay.
And I think I do so not only on behalf of Singaporeans, but all my brothers and sisters in ASEAN. Because we in Southeast Asia have a stake in peace and good relations between these two great countries, China and Japan, who are destined to live to the end of time as neighbors. From ASEAN's point of view, the Chinese and Japanese economies are fundamentally complementary and not competitive. And until a few years ago, the degree of economic interdependence between them was extremely high. There's every reason why these two countries should cooperate, and there's no reason why they should view each other as enemies. The dispute over Senkaku Diaoyu is a very old one. And when relations were normalized between China and Japan, the leaders of the two countries agreed on how to deal with this. Let us go back to status quo ante Prime Minister Noda's nationalization of these islands. My other appeal to them is that since both of you are so sure that your sovereignty claim over Senkaku Diaoyu is a superior one, why don't you behave like great statesmen and agree to refer this dispute to the International Court of Justice?
Thank you, Professor Koh, for those wise comments. I mean, I think this is a question which appeared somewhere too, whether over the Senkakus and the Diaoyu Islands, China should take it up to the International Court of Justice. And Professor Shinoda in his paper says that Japan probably will not object.
Tommy, thank you very much for the question. Actually, China and Japan have got different understanding of the basis of the international law documents. If you look at the Cairo Declaration and the Boston Proclamation, you will find it is defined. Of course, if you look at the bilateral agreement, San Francisco agreement or peace agreement they mentioned, in which both governments of China, government in Beijing and the government in Taiwan are excluded. So in the understanding of most Chinese, it's a new version of the Munich Agreement after the Second World War. And of course, the agreement of the reversion of Ryukyu Islands to Japan should not have covered Diaoyu Island. Because Diaoyu Island, according to the historical materials, according to the Cairo Declaration, as well as the Potsdam Proclamation, all the territories which are occupied by Japan through war should be returned to China. So I don't think there is the necessity for us to go to the justice of the international world justice of. If that happens, I think the whole world will be in a great mess. Because any country can change the world order. The whole world, I don't think, will live in peace and stability. So that is very, very dangerous. So I hope that the international community and the countries in East Asia will take into consideration the different understandings between China and Japan. Thank you.
Can I respond? Yeah. Japan's current territory is not defined by Japan itself. It's defined by San Francisco Peace Treaty. And San Francisco Peace Treaty override any discussions before the World War II was over, including Cairo declarations. By saying that, and Japan's government official position is there's no territorial dispute, and it was Chinese side which continuously avoided the discussion in the negotiation of 1972 normalization between the two countries and 1978 negotiation over the U.S. Japan-China friendship treaties. So, but I was informed by a credible government source. Although we do not recognize that the dispute between the two countries, Japan is willing to accept that the Chinese suit if it's brought to the International Court of Justice. And I hope to see that. And there's two most important elements in terms of international law, which territory belongs: effective control. China never has effectively controlled the islands. And second is when you claim the territory, China never claimed until 1971. Although there's only one document which mentions as a part of Iran district of Taiwan, 1871. But there's nothing. Previous edition of the same document didn't have anything about the Senkaku Islands. So I don't think that the Chinese have enough document to support their claim.
I believe that the island of Diaoyu Island is the result of the war between China and the United States, between China and Japan in 1894 and 5, because Japanese emperor issued an order. And after that, it's a secret order. And after that, on January 14th, 1951, Japanese emperor issued a protocol order which formally opened the annexation to the world. This is the history. So it's not true that that China has never exercised actual control over that. What is the control of Japan? Have you ever stationed any troops there? Or have you ever had any inhabitants on the island?
Yes.
Or what else? So it's a problem. It's
the factories.
Yeah. Professor Ko.
Yeah, we had a factory.
Mr. Chairman, I think all these arguments and counter-arguments should be presented to the International Court of Justice.
Yes.
I want to ask Bonnie Glaser a question. I want to first tell Bonnie that she made a very good presentation. I think the United States has a very important role to play. You have better relations today with China and with Japan than they do with each other. So this puts you in a very pivotal situation. But you also have a treaty obligation to defend Japan in the event of a conflict. And you have clarified that this obligation extends to defending Japan if an armed conflict were to take place over Senkaku Diaoyi. So what I'd like to know from you is that, is the United States actively engaged in diplomacy with both Beijing and Tokyo to de-escalate and to find a peaceful way of resolving this dispute? And in the event of an accidental incident, is there a way in which the United States can avoid starting a third world war with China?
Thank you, Tommy. Very important set of questions. It is clear that the United States is in a difficult position as a result of the tense relations between China and Japan. The United States, I think, will not mediate this dispute, nor should we, in my personal view. We cannot be completely objective. Obviously, Japan, as you say, is a treaty ally. But that's not to say that the United States has been ignoring the problem or has failed to be proactive in encouraging both countries to take some steps to diffuse the tensions between them. And we saw this, I think, in many examples when in the first Obama term. I'm sure you remember when Secretary Clinton asked 4 retired, very senior, distinguished officials to go to both Japan and China and talk to leaders in both countries. Of course, our senior officials as well, sitting officials, have raised these issues. And particularly, I think the message has been to encourage both countries to exercise self-restraint, to not do anything to further inflame tensions, and to try to find ways to prevent accidents or to set up mechanisms that if there were to be an inadvertent collision of some kind, that the situation could be de-escalated and controlled. A lot of progress was made between China and Taiwan in this area, although nothing has been really implemented yet. So I think that this is something that the United States continues to do. I think we take very seriously the heightened tensions between both countries, and frankly also between Japan and South Korea. In some ways, this is of even greater concern to the United States and more difficult because both of those countries are our allies. So I think this is a set of diplomatic issues that the United States is extremely engaged in, but it is difficult for the United States, as I say, to be any kind of a mediator. I think that's impossible.
Okay, we have 10 minutes more. So, any questions or comments anymore? Yes, Adrian.
The general has mentioned about, didn't clearly hear about something like Cold War once. Is there a possibility of a Cold War in East Asia, that both sides will not give in? Because during Confucianism, you don't want to lose face. But then, on the other hand, have you all thought about the economic repercussions? I mean, we're talking about military. Military people will always talk about military and so forth and politics. But what about the economic repercussions in East Asia and in Southeast Asia? And remember, we have just got $1 billion investment in Singapore, and that could be affected in the future and also in ASEAN. What do you all say about that, the economic considerations?
So what's your specific question? I'm not very clear.
Now, the question is that has China and Japan thought about the economic repercussions if there is a Cold War, if there is conflict, because of the issues in Senkaku or whatever it is, or if there's a clash or whatever it is? economic things is very important. In the sense that, I mean, we always talk about military. But what about the economic repercussions?
Yeah, as I mentioned just now, that the tension between China and Japan over Diaoyu Island has already produced very serious consequences over the bilateral security, bilateral economic ties. And of course, Japan has put forward the Abe economic, which has been successful to some extent. It seems to me it is expanding its investment outside with the intention of contending with China. I think that will be very, very dangerous because I don't think that sort of behavior will be in the interest of China, because China is short of energy, short of resources, because China has a very, very huge market. And China's future development will be heavily dependent on the resources outside, because China will continue to invest a lot in its economy, while Japan spends that much in Africa, in Southeast Asia, even in South Asia. What's for? So that is the problem. I don't think some of the investment of Japan in these countries will have enough interest from this sort of investment, because we have got different purposes. Of course, if the Japanese, just for purpose of contending with China, invest in those countries, I think that will be a problem. Of course, I have to admit that even though the tensions between China and Japan, the direct investment of Japan in China is still increasing. The trade is seriously affected by China. Of course, in last year, we have witnessed the increased purchase of Japanese cars in China, or increased sale volume of Japanese cars in China, but I don't think that will last long if the tension continue to be as such. Thank you.
Just short comment. I think Beijing government is very successful delinking economic issues from the political issues, and Japan is not. Japan is doing the same thing. We are not imposing any restriction over the economic activity of the business community. So I think both China and Japan realize its economic importance to each other.
Any questions, comments?
Yes, good morning.
Yes.
I came down from Kuala Lumpur for the forum today. I'd like to turn to the South China Sea for a moment. In the last year, in 2013, we saw an escalation of incidents between China and Malaysia, China, Vietnam, and especially China, Philippines over South China Sea claims. And I'd like to ask the panelists what you think is the outlook for these claims in 2014, and how do the claimant countries try and reduce tensions in the coming year? Thank you.
Okay, very brief responses. Yeah. What is
Bonnie first. Bonnie first.
Maybe with
Bonnie first.
Bonnie, please.
I think that there have been ongoing sets of problems in the South China Sea, and some of them, I think we've seen some improvement. Others, perhaps we've seen a deterioration. There's a recent story, for example, about fishing regulations issued by the, I think the Hainan government that raises some questions. And I haven't yet seen the law, so I will refrain from commenting on it specifically. But I think that the fact that China agreed last year to begin the discussions of code of conduct is certainly potentially positive. I think ultimately we all hope that this won't take 10 years. The United States stands for a legally binding agreement, would like to see it negotiated as soon as possible. And I think having a dispute settlement mechanism is also critically important. But there were some positive developments last year. I think the incident that was of greatest concern to me was the Scarborough Shoal incident in June of 2012, which was the first change in the status quo of a land feature, I think, if I'm correct, since 1999, and was a result of a verbal agreement between Beijing and Manila to actually end this standoff amicably and return the status quo ante, which the Philippines complied with and then China reneged on. That, to me, was an incident that really is something to worry about in the future. So one hopes that it doesn't happen again someplace else. And there are some other areas where we could see potential increased tensions. So the picture is mixed. I think that in October, I think 24th, 25th of last year, there was a very important high-level meeting, a work conference in China on the relationship between China and its neighbors, referred to as a periphery diplomacy meeting. I think this suggests perhaps that China has recognized that there have been some negative consequences to their behavior with the region, their actions, and recent visits to the region by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, I think, have demonstrated that China does want to increase and improve its relations with the region. There's certainly been an emphasis on economic outreach. So a lot more progress that needs to be made, but I don't think it's completely a negative picture.
South China Sea.
South China Sea, yeah. I strongly support the idea of keeping the framework of July 2010, that the ASEAN Regional Forum produced the multilateral approach to solve the issues instead of doing it the bilateral basis. And Japan has been working on it, and it is very important to build a consensus within among the ASEAN countries as well. Thank you.
What is the outlook for South China Sea in 2014?
I believe that in 2014, South China Sea will be stable. And I don't think we will have any incident, because if you look at history, whenever Chinese take some reactive actions, the situation here will remain stable for quite a long time. As you remember that before the occupation of Mischief Island by China, Chinese once warned the other claimants not to expand the occupation, but nobody listened. No country listened. I mean, those claimants over the South China Sea. But after China's occupation of Mischief Island, the situation here kept stable for so many years. So after this that's occupation is actually a reaction to the occupation by other claimants in this over South China Sea. So I think China's reaction over Philippines retaining and of China's fishermen will create a new period of stability in this region. Thank you.
Okay, I think our time is up, and so let's thank our three speakers for the excellent presentations and the various points and insights they delivered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daljit Singh, and our distinguished panelists. That was a very interesting discussion. We have a very special arrangement for today's lunch. Each speaker will be seated at different tables. This is your opportunity to network with them and ask them your questions. You have that.